Hello and welcome back to everything you wanted to know about second language acquisition but were afraid to ask. Today I'm continuing my conversation with Dr. Vedran Dronjic from Carnegie Mellon University, and last time we talked about vocabulary acquisition and how important vocabulary it is for language learning, and specifically we talked about the numbers and how many word families learners need to learn. The numbers were absolutely huge, so it's a lot of work, it's a lot of learning. So we would want to know, how could we do it faster? How could we do it in a more efficient way? Because you want to learn a language faster. That's true. So I do know that teachers and learners have a lot of misconceptions and myths about vocabulary learning. And I do know that you have prepared a list of those myths. So I'm wondering if you could share them with us.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not trying to be negative, but we do have to say what not to do in order to know what to do, in a sense, right?
Yes.
So I have prepared a list of 6 myths about vocabulary learning.
Okay.
Shall we start with the first one?
Let's go.
Okay, well, the first myth is that if you put students in a communicative language classroom where there's a lot of conversation, they view videos and they listen to music and they have fun,
Yeah.
and they might have a good textbook to boot, then that's all that needs to happen. They'll just pick up the vocabulary somehow, magically. They'll just soak it up. It won't happen. It doesn't happen. So one way that teachers try to encourage students to learn vocabulary is by having them read a lot or watch a lot of television or just watching movies. And well, this is certainly great. In and of itself, it will not help you learn vocabulary. Okay?
So how do I learn vocabulary then?
Well, think about this. If you just read, if you take let's say 3 or 4 lessons of your second language a week, and you dedicate one entire lesson to just reading for enjoyment, reading something you really like, it'll probably take you something like 29 years to learn the first 2,000 word families of English.
If I learn,
If you just read.
If I just read but not
Yeah.
not make any effort to learn words.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you really need to study that vocabulary. If you're a learner, if you're a teacher, you really need to teach that vocabulary deliberately and explicitly
Okay.
to your students. Now, if you're one of those more industrious students who go home and then continue reading or watch TV or watch a movie or listen to music, it may take you something like 7 years
Still a long
to
time.
pick up the
Yeah.
vocabulary, the
Yeah.
first 2,000 words, and this is really elementary vocabulary. So if, however, as a teacher, you approached it systematically and said, I'm going to teach my students 50 words a week, okay? It'll take about 1 year to get them to that 2,000 level, which is the foundation for vocabulary knowledge. So the message from this is, no, they will not pick it up. You need to teach it,
Okay.
and it has to be organized.
Okay. What about myth 2?
Myth number 2, yes. So myth number 2 is that students know frequent words and that teachers teach frequent words. This is not correct at all. I mean, if we look at the list of going from most frequent to less frequent to the very infrequent words in English, what we find is that if a student knows, and the average student will know something like, say, 3,000 word families, they don't know the 3,000 most important words that they need to know. Their knowledge is actually spread over a very large sort of band, if you will, of frequencies. And so they know a lot of vocabulary that is not very useful, and they don't know a lot of words that are very, very useful.
I know you have a couple of funny examples of words that are actually not particularly useful. And
Yes, so some of my colleagues have looked at textbooks and analyzed them to see what kinds of words are presented and how they're presented, and they've also gone into classrooms to observe what it is that teachers teach. And one funny example that I just read recently was in a classroom in Montreal. The teacher explained cummerbund. And this is a very, very infrequent and not very useful word in English.
Absolutely.
We'll have to admit. Another thing that teachers are really guilty of, I have to say, and I was guilty of it at some point in my career, is that they teach a lot of idioms and they teach a lot of proverbs, and these are things that are actually not very frequent in texts and in conversations. I'm not saying that you shouldn't know idioms or proverbs, but this is not the first thing that you need to be focusing on in a language classroom. You need to build that solid foundation of 9,000 more frequent word families, and then at some later time, and probably through just reading and listening, students are going to learn all this other stuff.
Okay, let's move on to myth number 3.
Actually, before we do,
There's
one
more.
last thing that we
Yeah.
need to say is that textbooks and teachers are guilty of not recycling enough.
Oh, yes.
Students need to see the same word many, many times before even remembering it. And that's something like 6 to 7 times.
Okay, so that's the magic number a lot of people ask me about. How many times do you need to see a word before you memorize the form, right?
So if you didn't sit down to memorize it deliberately, it's going to take you about 6 to 7 encounters to learn most words, to just remember the form. Now remember, beyond this, you're going to need a lot more exposure to that word in different contexts to actually know the word properly, because there's so much to learn. Teachers and textbooks do not recycle vocabulary enough.
That's very true.
Yes.
Let's move on to the next myth.
Myth number 3 is that rote learning is bad for you.
What's rote learning?
Well, rote learning means memorizing. So you sit down, you memorize the word, and you memorize what it means. Somehow it's seen as something that you're not supposed to do because it's boring and onerous. In actual fact, it's the most effective, it's the single best way to begin learning a word.
Okay.
You memorize, and then you see it in many different contexts.
I think by this time a lot of people already hate us because we've kind of dispelled things
Probably.
that they've believed in.
But what is easy in life?
Yeah, I agree.
Nothing is easy.
We have three more. Let's move on a little bit faster. Let's move on to myth 4.
Well, myth number 4 is that translation is bad for you. So you sit down, you see the word in the second language, you translate it to the first language to remember it. This is actually the most natural way to learn a word, and that's what every learner does at the beginning. Then you move on to different strategies. So translation is fine.
Okay.
Do it.
Especially when you're a beginner or like a lower level learner.
Absolutely.
You absolutely have to do it.
It's never bad for you, but it's particularly not bad at the beginning.
I entirely agree. Myth 5.
Myth number 5 is, and this is a big one, and both learners and teachers are really guilty of not doing it right. Teachers teach words that are related to each other on one occasion to people who've never seen these words. So one good example is teaching 10 different kinds of fruits at the same time, or 5 different kinds of furniture.
Yes.
Okay. I know that it seems logical to do that. I know that it seems easy, right? Why not do it on one occasion? The problem with this is that learners tend to confuse the words. So they see them all at the same time. They say, okay, apple means, and then they translate it to their first language. Banana means, they translate that. But often these translations are misconnected or mislabeled. And what happens is that they end up not knowing the proper meaning of many of those words. And this is a big, big problem. Yeah. Another thing you shouldn't do is teach opposites at the same time. Good and bad, you know what, take a day. Teach good today and bad tomorrow.
Right. Because we want learners to learn faster and in a more efficient way.
Yes.
And if you teach opposites at the same time or thematic vocabulary at the same time, it actually doesn't help vocabulary retention.
Well, you know what? There's a good way and a bad way to do thematic. So while you should not say table, chair, and love seat in one session, you can say table, pad, iPad, cup or mug in one session. These are words that are not of the same kind, yet they tend to go together. And that's not a problem.
Okay, that's good to know.
And it's not as much of a problem.
Finally, myth number 6. Yeah.
Myth number 6 is that teaching single words is all it takes, right? So you teach your students that table means this, right? Well, that doesn't really take care of vocabulary learning because a lot of language happens in context, right? And so what students need to know is when I say something like hair, You know, do I say dense hair or do I say thick hair? Which one is natural? Only one of those is natural, right? If I say wait, do I say wait for me? Do I say wait to me? Or do I say wait on me? There's no way of knowing this unless you memorize this. And you know what? Memorizing is one thing, but also learning in context, right? So teachers need to emphasize what words go together, not just single words.
Yeah, I entirely agree. So this is absolutely wonderful, and I hope we didn't anger too many people.
I hope not.
If we did, that's completely fine. And I would like you to thank Dr. Vedran Dronjic. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. And if you want to learn about how we teach in the Embodied English course, you can always go to our website. You can see the link below. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.